Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very first webinar for 2023 in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub Expanded Horizon Series, brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Wagaya people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining you from today, and I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which each of you are joining us today. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present today. My name is Prue Cook. I'm from Nine Creeks Consulting and I'm your webinar host across this series. This webinar series is for those of us who work with farming and regional communities from policy to the paddock, and it challenges us to think differently regarding how we approach extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. Through this series, we explore novel thinking and new ideas from different sectors, industries and countries to stimulate new approaches to collaboration and building resilience. Now, our guest for today, I'm very lucky to have sitting right next to me. She happened to be doing some work in the area, so it's fantastic to have her here with me, and it's Kate Burke. Kate is the director of Think Agri. She has a background as a researcher, a lecturer for an agricultural college, an agronomist for many years, a commercial manager for a corporate agribusiness, and now she's the director of her own company, has an author and dabbles in a little bit of farming at the side. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you, Prue. Thanks for that more than generous introduction. Perfect. Lovely to be here and great to be here in person.
Absolutely. Now, Kate's topic for today has actually been contributed to us by you, the people who participate in this webinar. So you always have the opportunity to reach out to me and give suggestions for webinar topics or presenters that you'd like to hear from in the future. So towards the end of last year, I had two bits of feedback. One saying I'd like a topic on how do we get long-term mindsets developed within the farming community. And the other question was, how can we talk to farmers about drought when they're currently in flood? So that's been the impetus to come up with today's webinar topic and to get Kate on board. Now, if you've participated in one of these webinars before, we're not about death by PowerPoint. Kate and I are going to have a chat about her work, and we invite you to ask questions or share your own experiences through the chat function at any time. You're also going to be sent a recording after this finishes, so please don't worry if you need to leave early. So, Kate, you run your own business, Think Agri. Who do you work with and what services do you provide?
Thanks, Prue. So I work with a range of entities. Some of the work I do is in sort of, I guess, what you'd call broad communication. So, and the audiences for that are people like yourself and people who are on this call. So not only farmers, but people who provide services to farmers, whether they be researchers or extension officers or commercial service providers. And a lot of that work is around the concepts of what I call excellent farming and, being good at farming in the long term, hence the book. The other work I do is some strategic work with farm businesses. I've got a handful of clients where we do comprehensive strategic work, and they can be mainly cropping, grazing businesses and some larger sort of corporate type entities. And that's really about helping them with setting their strategy and doing the sorts of thinking that you normally don't sit down to do. And they just want sort of some external accountability to help them identify what are the pressing issues in their business at a strategic level and then work a pathway forward to solve some problems.
And so that gap in terms of thinking that they don't usually do, was that a sort of a driver to start your business? That was the gap that you saw in the market?
It was one of the gaps. I guess it's called Think Agri for a reason. And that is because, I love agriculture. But it's the way we think about agriculture, and I think there's room for smarter thinking about agriculture, both inside the business and those of us all that work to help people who run farming businesses. So there definitely is a gap. It's something that I thought in my time in corporate ag, their emphasis on planning was quite strong, and their emphasis on procedures. And I thought we could take some formal things out of that. But what I thought farming businesses, family farming businesses do well is the intuitive, flexible planning and being able to adapt well. And that was something that I sort of tried to introduce into corporate, some more flexible thinking. So I just saw that there was an opportunity to take the best of both worlds and put it into a bit of a package and talk about it.
Perfect. Now, we always kick off these webinars with a bit of a 101, going over some basic terminology and concepts, which is particularly for the new practitioners in our audience. Before we do, one thing that Kate is very good at is coming up with anecdotes on the fly. So for you in the audience, if you'd like to pop in any particular areas that you're working in, where you're wanting to encourage long-term thinking, so that might be in relation to reducing herbicide usage or drought resilience planning, succession planning. If there's anything in particular that you're working on, please feel free to pop it in the comments, and Kate might be able to actually give you some tangible examples or advice specific to what you're needing to know as we go through.
Well, we'll see.
Yeah. I've also noticed we've had quite a few farmers register for today's webinar as well too. So if you're a farmer and you're looking at, you know, some long-term thinking for your own farm business, pop your thoughts in terms of where you're wanting to go there, and we'll try and address that as we go. All right, so before we start with the farming community specifically, let's talk about all of humankind. Is thinking and planning for the long term something people are naturally good at?
Nothing like a easy question to start with, Prue, and one that you can give a simple answer to. Well, there's no simple answer to this question, but if you think about human evolution, the answer is yes and no. So the answer is, to go back to 80,000 years ago, cave people time, we need to be very short-term focused because we've got to make sure we don't die. No, there's a brontosaurus coming over to eat us, let's get out of the way. As life's got a bit more sophisticated, longer-term planning,
less brontosauruses.
But I guess even back in brontosaurus days, you know, going to hibernate in the cave, well, we need to make sure we've got enough food for 6 months. So there's always been an element of long-term and short-term planning. Now, is it something that comes naturally, or is it something that everybody can do? Basically, it comes down to a handful of things, I think, and this is a combination of my research in brain science and thinking science, and also my observations. Some personality types, some job types, some family types, I guess, may have a tendency to being able to look ahead and look outside, whereas other personality types are more inclined to look at the next problem straight in front of them and be very practical and wanting to do things. And so in the Myers-Briggs work that was done a few years ago about farmer temperaments, I think it was the ST types were very good at that immediate, you know, practical, what are we going to do? What do we need to do right now? Whereas the more intuitive, I think it was might have been the NJ types or the NP types are more likely to look at those bigger pictures. And farmers tended to be more of that former type. But there's certainly, and there's another Clifton Strengths Finder, their human traits. Not everybody has that ability to see possibilities.
Yeah.
Yep. And I know I'm one that thinks of everything as endless possibilities. Yeah.
Perfect. Are we getting better at long-term thinking and planning, or you know, have we got the busyness of life? Is that making it more challenging for us to be able to be effective at it?
Well, I think it's a really good question too. And in general, I suppose if we take COVID as an example and the pandemic, I think that just became around, well, how do we survive the next day? How do we get the kids homeschooled? You know, we might have had shorter extended periods we're looking at. Have we got enough toilet paper? But there was a lot of that, well, just next problem to next problem. So sometimes you're in survival mode. I think if we flip to farming for a second, think we are getting better at longer term planning, and having gone through a lot of regions, sort of some reasonable seasons, they're more inclined to consider long-term planning when they're in reasonable season time. Whereas if you're in survival mode, it's really just about, let's just get to the next step.
Yeah, perfect. And then let's throw a hard question out early. Can long-term thinking be taught, or is it something you either have or you don't, particularly if it's aligned to personality types?
I think it can be taught, absolutely, but it's like anything, talk about, I don't mind sharing anecdotes, and I don't mind a sporting metaphor either. You're a roller derby girl, and I'm sure you've seen people on the, what do you call it, a pitch?
Track.
A track.
Yep.
So you've got people on the track, their first go, they've just got the right amount of aggression, the right amount of coordination, the right amount of roller skating ability, and then you'll have others that aren't naturally good at it but can be taught because they've got the skills that they can learn, and then you've got others that it's just not for them. So I think this is a bit like that, but you need motivation. You need to be motivated to become a planner, and I suspect, I think part of our role is trying to understand who we're working with, and how do we, what's the motivation and what's the need.
Perfect. So let's think specifically about farmers and farm businesses now. What are the things that you see that drive farmers to think and plan for the long term?
Yeah, that's a good one. I think those that, if I can just borrow the book for a second.
Yes.
And there's a reason why it's called Crops, People, Money and You, and pardon the blurry camera for a second there. Yeah, there we go. The things that I see that motivate or drive farmers is knowing their vision and wanting to succeed, but also having a good mix of both technical skill, people skills, including organisation and relationship skills, and a good sort of sense of appreciation of finance and profit focus, so that you need to be able to project forward, and a sense of self-management, and that's the you part in it.
The elephant in the room is that added complexity that seasonal variability brings, and how does that affect farmers' ability to think and plan for the long term?
Well, I actually reckon it, there's two bits to that. There's two camps. One camp will say, well, we're not sure what's going to happen next, because by hell, we've had some strange, we've had everything in the last 10 years. So we need to be prepared for whatever. So that sort of encourages long-term planning. Others find it difficult to get specific with long-term planning because the first barrier to them is this uncertainty. Well, we don't know what next season's going to be like. And so it can be, seasonal variability can be a barrier. Personally, I think now we've got the climate tools to demystify that a bit, and it doesn't need to be a barrier.
Perfect. What other barriers do you find that farmers are facing when they're thinking and planning for the long term?
Well, farming's really complex, and you might need to do another flick.
Sure.
Because so that's my fault, everybody, that the camera keeps getting a bit blurry, because we need to avoid sudden movement, and I talk a lot with my hands. Yeah. So I'm way too expressive, so I'll try and be really still and see how we go. Farming's really complex, and I guess this is the thing to understand. We need to have a systems whole of complexity view here. And so we've got people who, I think it's over 90% of farms are family owned. So we've got people that actually have grown up together, people that have different dynamics, got in-laws involved, all these things. So all of a sudden, we've got to get people to agree. So that's one barrier. If you don't like each other, it's actually pretty hard to agree. Yeah. We may have different attitudes towards money. We may be in different positions in our business in terms of risk and stability. So that can be a barrier. There's so many things, but the biggest thing is probably this whole issue around appreciating the complexity of a business, and I think we do have a default, particularly in agriculture and agricultural science, to be a bit reductionist and treat things in boxes. So we'll have our plant genetics, research over here, and we'll have our farm business management economics over here. And you can't separate things like that, because weed control influences, sheep digestibility and live game, which then influences another part of the business. And then, does the person like sheep or dislike sheep? So it's so integrated, and we need to appreciate that complexity.
Perfect.
Long answer, sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. What happens when farm businesses don't plan for the long term? What can go wrong?
One thing that can, so one of the biases, so we're all human, and I guess these comments, I just want to say these comments aren't coming from a point of judgment. I'm someone who's farming myself, and I am officially the world's worst grain seller, so I'll just put that out there. So I know this stuff is hard. One of the observations I make that traps people who aren't instinctively longer term planners is what I would call immediacy bias.
Yep.
So we've just had a wet year. Things, you may have had really bad results with your wheat, for example, and the person who has a tendency to react to what's happened most recently will then not want to grow wheat next year. Or they might be somebody who chases prices. So this year they'll be chasing, commodity X and Y, and then next year they'll do a flip. The trouble if you have these sort of knee-jerk reactions is you really, it's like punting, and they're the farms that I've actually unfortunately seen go broke, those ones that are just so reactive.
Yeah. Okay. How do things like values, networks, and the ability to learn from failure impact strategic thinking and long-term thinking in farm businesses?
Oh, this is an interesting question. Well, values create the motivation, and differences in values can create the conflict that becomes a barrier. So if one business partner is particularly obsessed with money and worried about earning money, worried about spending, reluctant to spend money, and then the other partner may be just really into growth and wanting to invest and spend, we're going to have this constant conflict. And so that all comes down to, money's more important and more valued by one than the other. Networks are fantastic because they broaden the horizon of people, and farmers are particularly peer focused. I made the comment this morning at with a new client about, I still think most blokes are sort of like teenage boys a bit, and if they've got their 3 or 4 farming mates, they are a bit influenced by what's happening in the network. So there's positives and negatives of networks.
And before we go on to learning from failures there, that networking thing with long-term planning is a bit more challenging. Like, obviously we say farmers love peer-to-peer learning, and it's very easy when it's something you can look over the fence and see, but you can't actually see that someone is planning for the long term. That's usually stuff that happens around a farm table.
Yeah, it's the more private stuff, and
that one's a bit hard for people to willingly talk about amongst a group of their peers. It's not as visible.
Well, yeah, that's right, and because I don't necessarily like talking about money, so things might happen on a particular farm without them telling that it's part of a succession plan, because mum and dad are actually shifting, in 5 years' time, or we're buying this air seeder because, for this reason. So that is tricky, that you don't always get the full story in your informal networking. And I think I'm really passionate about the fact, this thing I call the farm effect, which there's scientific evidence that shows that every farm in Australia is effectively statistically significantly different from the next farm. And so we have to be really mindful in networks and sharings that sometimes what happens on one farm may not be applicable to the other.
It doesn't translate. Okay. And so and the last part of that question was the ability to learn from failure.
Oh, failures are great because you never forget a failure. And I think one of the things we have to do is get better at fear of failure.
Yeah.
And I think if you can have a culture where failure is okay, and you can take, step up and take on that information and then think strategically about it, it can be really valuable.
Perfect. Provided you don't go the other way and be too reactive to failure or prevent you from trying again.
Yeah, it's about putting the failure in perspective.
Perfect. Now, what we really love to do in these webinars is give lots of practical advice. So let's now move into what we as extension practitioners or someone who works with regional and agricultural communities can do to design and deliver tactics that help farmers plan for the long term, like drought preparedness. So let's start at the very start. How do you get farmers, you mentioned the word be motivated in the first space. So how do you get that motivation, that engagement in the first instance? Is this something that you can hold an event or a workshop for? Or is this something that's best done one-to-one? How do you get people to think, oh, I need to plan for the long term in the first place?
Yeah, okay. So I want to take a step back here and be a little bit controversial.
I'd expect nothing less.
I mean, how do you know they need it in the first place? How do you know they need that training? How do you know that they're not already doing this stuff? So what are your assumptions? So that's where I'd start, is what are the assumptions that you, as the providers, particularly in the Drought Hub network, is what assumptions are you making about the people that you need to influence, or the people you're, expected to influence? So I'd start there, because some people may have this under control completely. It's just that it's not in the formal way that you may think of planning. I've seen so a big warning about don't judge a book by its cover. Some of the most dishevelled farmers I've ever worked with are brilliant long-term planners and very astute business people who are running a great ship. It's just that they're very informal and they're pretty cagey, and they don't necessarily want everyone to know they're going okay.
Yeah.
So that'd be my first thing. Let's not be judgy, and let's just ask ourselves a few assumptions and a few questions first. Having said that, the other thing I think we need to consider, let's assume that yes, there is a need to assist people in doing some planning training, is, well, what's the outcome? What do you want? What are we actually doing this for? Long-term planning to me isn't an outcome. It's just a tool you use to get somewhere else. So is it that you want the businesses in your area to all be running in 10 years' time? Is it that you want them to make good decisions and exit in a timely fashion if that's what they want to do? Is it that you want them to feel in control of their own destiny? And that's probably where I'm coming from. It's not for me to say that someone should be farming in 10 years' time or not. Yeah. That's for them to decide, but I want them to be in control of their own destiny.
Yeah.
And the last two things I'd say to answer that question is, what's the timing that we're trying to impose this stuff on, or I hope we're not imposing. I hope we're actually asking questions and
working with
and asking and co-designing an event or a process, and it's got to be when they're thinking about planning. And I find now's a time in most years where people do start to think a little bit long term. And
that's for grains business predominantly, but it'll
true.
be different from sector to sector.
Yeah, that's right. And in dairy, it's, it's more, they go on a financial year and in some of the livestock businesses, but it's about understanding when the lulls are or when the natural planning cycle occurs within the industry that you're dealing with, and when the busiest times are, when they don't want to talk to you. Don't talk to them when they don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, perfect. And so then to throw you one of the questions that was asked when I was planning this webinar, which was, how do we talk to farmers about drought when they're in flood?
Okay, so my question is, well, why would you want to?
Yeah.
Do you need to? Is it because you're trying to kick off a KPI? Is it because you're called the Drought Resilience Hub? And I'll be controversial here when, I'd prefer a name that might be Business Resilience or Forever Farming Hubs as opposed to Drought, because there's more than drought's only one form of hardship in farming. But my first question is, well, just let it lie. Don't talk to them about drought when their mindset is in flooding.
Yeah, because that's going to be there in that's the brontosaurus, isn't it? They're going to be in that fight or flight mode, and that ability to think long term isn't going to be there. Yeah.
So I suppose, and this might jump into one of the others, Prue, but it's really about stepping into the other person's shoes, so your cohort that you're working with, and thinking about, well, what's best for them, and then trying to balance that, and I'll be realistic. One of the many of you on this call are working within bureaucratic frameworks, and you do have targets to meet and KPIs to tick and milestones and whatnot, and that can be difficult. So it's about working out the most practical way to be able to tick off on those milestones and be mindful of the audience.
Yeah. Okay. Which is a big challenge about how we operate within those, for sure.
Yeah.
When we talk about thinking long-term planning, who should be involved both in and out of the farm businesses? Where are farmers going to be most likely influenced here, particularly when we mentioned before that it's a hard thing to actually, for other people to see whether a farm business is, well, in the immediate term anyway, whether a farm business is a long-term planning or not.
Yeah, so I suppose, just go back one little step.
Sure.
Just thought that to finish the answer to that first question, it's about you're trying to sell the concept. So you've got to sell the benefit of long-term planning and provide tangible evidence that this is useful, and provide tangible anecdotes and evidence of what happens if you don't do it.
Yeah.
And that example before that I told of, flipping from barley to wheat to whatever based on the markets, and a farm growing broke in 5 years' time, that's pretty good motivation if you want to be farming, as to why don't do that strategy, but let's have a good long-term rotation that is economically and financially robust, as well as agronomically robust. So providing that motivation or evidence for that motivation is really important. So once you get past that step, and it's, well, who, okay, we're going to do a plan, who should be involved? Well, the short answer is it depends. Is this a 5-year plan, business plan, and succession and everything's already sorted out? Mm-hmm. If that's the case, it could involve, if you think about the crops, people, money aspects, there could be some agronomic planning in there. It could be some financial planning. So it's going to be a mix of those people. Farmers have a tendency, though, to deal with their individual advisors separately, and it's problematic, I think, as a culture, because the context of each conversation isn't translated. So I really like it when you can get at least some continuity, and I guess that's what I do a bit, is I tend to talk to the agronomist, sometimes to the banker, sometimes to the accountant, and be the person that brings all the conversations together, so that the context doesn't get lost. within the business, although who should be at the table? Well, obviously the people that have a financial stake. So it's not much point doing a plan if it's just the operational generation, yet they don't own anything, and all the money's still with the older generation. You know, you need to be mindful of that, and I think it's useful to have staff involved as well at appropriate times, particularly if they're highly involved in the business.
Excellent. Now, I want to talk about some tools and techniques that you use to get farm businesses to think big picture. Let's start with, before, if we go back a couple of steps, where you mentioned that now there's a number of climate tools that really help with that long-term planning. So let's start by ticking off some of those climate tools that you use to talk to your clients.
Yeah, so my favourite tools are, I love using Climate, the app. I love using all the JDC AgVic tools, what's the name?
The fast break?
Yeah, the fast break, but the actual website where you can go in and dial up any previous years profit something or other. Apologies for not having this off the top of my head. We will get that to you in the post note links. But anything that can give you some scenarios in terms of climate, the BOM stuff is really good now too, just the BOM updates. And how I use that is to get a gauge of what might the next season look like, but also get a gauge of, you know, in the previous 20 to 30 years, in more recent times, what have those types of seasons done in the past, particularly on the individual farm you might be working on. And so you can use those climate tools to then come up with what I call a concept of climate moods. So is the climate in a wet mood, a dry mood, or somewhere in between? What does that mean for your farm? So then you get some scenarios going. So that's one tool. The other tools are, at a broader business, is reflective questions, and then getting people to talk about their answers to those questions as a group. And that can be quite interesting because, let's face it, we're not good at communicating with our families. We expect osmosis. And so to have some facilitated way of hearing what the other person is thinking in a safe manner is really useful.
Can you give us some examples of some reflective questions that you'd commonly use?
So the questions that I use might be, well, you know, why, what's the most important thing for you in farming? How influence, so this is just random questions. So I've got 60 of them that I use, which is a few. What influences your choice? How influenced by your peers are you? How influenced by your family are you? How influenced by making a profit are you? You know, so a lot, not much. What do your family say about working with you? And a few questions to try and judge, sort of get a gauge of self-awareness.
Yeah.
How important is making money for you? How important is productivity to you? What sort of a record keeper do you consider yourself? So I'm just trying to get a gauge of how that business operates and sort of extract the values out in a way that rather than going through a values exercise as such, you can usually see, well, okay, this family is very growth orientated, this family is very particular about what they do, but family and looking after each other is first. Do you have holidays? And just all these sort of trying to get that whole of systems thinking.
And that's, we were talking offline before, Kate, that the facilitation techniques here are incredibly useful, because sometimes understanding that motivator or that outcome, like that, where do you want to be in 5 years or 10 years question, can actually, for a lot of people, be really challenging to answer. And so that's the skill of the good facilitator, is to be able to elicit that, to then help know what the levers are to pull for that forward planning.
That's right. So through this reflective question, I'll say, well then what I do is get them to compare their answers and then say, well, what are the common themes? And so there might be a theme around succession planning, surprise, surprise, or a theme around growth and expansion, or a theme around, drought proofing their farm. And it's like, okay, well, that's a theme now, in 5 years' time, what does that look like? But I know myself, if people say to me, what's your 5-year plan? I go, oh, goal setting, oh, God. But if they say, well, you're 54, what are you going to be doing when you're 59? That's tangible.
Yeah.
So I tend to use, another tool I use is setting out timelines and getting them to each do each other's timeline. Well, who do you think is going to be the manager in 5 years' time? What's Prue going to be doing in 5 years' time? And that you also get to understand how they view each other.
Yeah, and that was a really useful example I found in the book, and Kate's generously prepared a handout that we'll share at the end of the session. So anyone who's listening can email through or respond to the email that you'll get with the recording, and I can send that handout through to you. But that was a really nice example where you've looked at where different members of a farm business are going to be in future years and what role they're likely to play, which I thought was a really simple way of setting out on a page how people's roles are likely to change and then what needs to be done to help each of those individuals prepare for that. So that was a really simple, effective tool that I thought in reading the book.
And it works really well. They actually get into the exercise. So effectively, it's what I call ages and stages of farming. So you've got what I call the intern or apprentice stage, then there's the manager stage, then there's the mentor stage, and then there's the elder stage. And when you break it down like that and give them some tangible terms to think about and say, well, where do you think you are? And where do you think Prue is? And where do you think Kate is? And then I say to Prue, well, where do you think you are, Prue? And quite often you'll get different answers. Mm. And then we'll say, well, okay, looks like we've got 4 managers here. And no wonder we're all having a little bit of a fight. Or somebody might be expecting Kate to be acting like a manager, and Kate's just been on the farm for 6 months. So Kate well and truly thinks she's in intern mode and is looking for some guidance from her parents, and they're just expecting her to, just know what to do. So it's a great conversation piece, and you can see then it's like, well, or down the other end, Prue might be, she might have checked out mentally, and so she considers herself an elder, whereas the younger generation really want her to still be acting as a mentor and want her to stay involved in the business. Yeah, so it's a good tool.
Excellent, very much so. Now, you've also mentioned when we were talking about this as well too, understanding and ensuring safety was really, really important when you're helping work towards big picture. How do you ensure that safety? Because obviously when you're having challenges about, well, I think I'm an elder, but I'd like to, everyone else wants, when you're getting people to be vulnerable and say where they think they are, where, get other people to say where they think they are, there's a lot of vulnerability involved in that.
Yeah, there is. So you need to gauge whether, if you're working one-on-one with a family, you need to gauge whether they're ready for that conversation or not. So I actually undertake to have private conversations before we put the whole family in a room, just so I know whether that's a useful tool or not. Yeah. See a lot of mistakes happen. Families come to me and say, oh, we tried to manage this ourselves and we should have got some help. And the reason for that was they were trying to stay safe, so they weren't actually saying what they thought, or it just blew up. And I think if you're running discussion groups with the farm business discussion groups with the view to be doing some planning, also need to be mindful about who's in that group and what the element of trust is in amongst the group, and whether or not it's safe for people to be vulnerable in front of their neighbours or not. because sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned scenario analysis
Yep.
as a really vital
sure.
tool that you use. Can you give us an example of how you'd run one of these?
Yeah, sure. And in the notes, you'll see there's a
I'll share them now.
There's a series of slides, and they're also in the book if anyone's got them, where I go through this process. So we'll do a scenario analysis on sort of, I guess, some more tactical planning rather than, 3 to 5 year planning. So we'll just talk about a seasonal scenario. And and this is a cropping related scenario, but you can convert this and do this for any other form of farming. Basically, so where's the money coming from? The money's coming from grain, primarily. Production, is going to contribute to about 70% of the income. The price component's probably 30%. Or even less. That's a bit of a furphy that we get so fixated with prices, because if you've got a portfolio of crops, individual prices isn't actually as important as you feel it is. It's just that prices are very visible, so we focus on them. So we're saying, okay, let's look at yield. Where does that yield going to come from? Dryland farming, the yield's going to come from moisture. So we're at this time of year. I'm talking to Prue about her farm, and the first thing I do is say, well, where are we now? Let's do an assessment of what's happening right now. Right now, our Prue's farm, 90% of the farm is chock full of water. Has she been up to date on her summer weeds? She's up to date, by the look on her face. 70% of the paddocks are really good. There's 3 paddocks where the weeds got away during harvest. So from that, we can get a judgment of starting soil moisture. Fast forward, we're just before cropping. We do this process again. So we know how much water we've got in the soil. Then we just use 3 different scenarios. So let's look at those climate tools we were looking at before. What happens in a decile 3 year at Diaper, Prue's farm? What happens in a decile 5 year? What happens in a very wet year? And so we get those numbers for what the growing season might look like, and we've done. So we've got our starting soil moisture, our 3 potential growing seasons, and then we just use whatever tool you like to calculate a yield. So whether you're a yield profit person or a French Schultz water use efficiency person, it doesn't really matter. You just do some water-based yield calculations, and you've got 3 different scenarios. And then from that, you can make some decisions. So you can do that process, paddock by paddock, or you can just do it really broad scale for each commodity. So you can basically do some revenue projections. And then the trick is, though, is you have to keep repeating the process as the year progresses, and you've got more information about rainfall and more information about what the likelihood of it being decile 3 or less, decile 5-ish, decile 3 to 7, and then super wet, and that's where the climate moods come in. So last year we knew pretty early on that there was a strong chance of getting the double whammy of an iodine negative and a La Nina, and we knew from tools like the climate forecast tools that when we have that double whammy, most districts get wet, and they get really wet in spring. And so you can start to plan for that, but you can also plan for, well, what if I'm in a district where it's not raining? So you can do those things, and it's great for grain marketing, it's great for nitrogen management. We focus a lot on soil and soil tests and all these things, but we're not so. It's actually the yield potential and revenue forecasting is where I think we need to focus on.
Perfect.
Yeah, and that process is in the notes.
Yep, and that's something too that gives you the beginning of the season. You've got so it helps to mentally prepare as well as prepare the business decisions. But you're like, okay, I've got examples of where things can go in any one direction, and this is what to expect.
And you can put some broad pricing based on historical data in there and say, well, okay, it's highly likely we're going to end up with $3 million revenue if we get this scenario. The way things are going, it's going to get really wet. We've lost paddock X, Y, and Z, but we're still on target for $4 million. We're actually okay. We feel crap, but we're okay.
Yeah, perfect. Now that handout, there's a download button you should see on your screen right now, which you can click to grab those handouts. Kate, another one that we discussed online was a particular framework that you used which was the 4 A's. Can you talk us through that one? Which is again in the notes.
Yeah, so I think there's and this is where the sort of, I guess, the nuance of how it's not just about technical issues, and it's not just about money, and it's not just purely about people. The first thing is awareness. So that's really understanding your business, and so understanding the people dynamics, understanding where the money's coming from, where the money's going, and being able to get that to a point of knowing those numbers at $1 per hectare level, understanding, your debt structure and how vulnerable or how secure you are. Usually the ones that need to worry don't, and the ones that don't, and the ones that worry a lot don't need to worry. So just having conversations around that. So that's all about awareness. And then the next bit is shifting from awareness to what I call acceptance. So what are the bits about the business we can't change? And so they're the constraints that we have to work within. Then the tricky bit around family businesses is agreements. So what are we going to agree to tackle?
Yeah.
And that's often where strategies and long-term planning gets tripped up, is that agreements bit. And then the last bit is action. And what we tend to do as doers in farming, we want to go straight to action. We want to go straight to the solution. So Kate, come and do my growth strategy, and can you tell me what structures what entities I should set up? Well, hang on, let's woo up a bit. That's a solution. Why are you wanting to grow? Who's coming home on the farm? Why are you doing this? So that's the process.
Perfect. Now we're getting towards the end, so if you do have any more questions, please feel free to pop them in and we'll go, but we've got a couple more important ones to ask. And this is, what do you do when the farm businesses that you're working with are struggling to think big picture or struggling to share?
Yeah, good question. So I've got 3, and again, there's a model, 3P model in the right at the end of that little handout. And it's about understanding the levels of planning. So big picture, it's the way you couch the question. So I say big picture planning is all about possibility. So if you couldn't fail and you had endless buckets of cash, what would you want to do? What are the ideas in your head? And if you can't be wrong. And sometimes, and you've got to stop people in the room from butting in.
Yeah.
So, and you get people to do stuff privately, and then we share. The next one is what I call probability planning. So that's when you take, okay, well, what are the limitations? So that goes back to that acceptance bit. With dryland farming at nil, so there's a fair chance that we can't grow poppies. So let's just put poppies yep, they were on the big picture table, but unless we go and buy a farm in Tasmania, we're probably not going to grow poppies. So that's probability, that's being practical. And then the next one is actually more practical, is what I call practical planning, and that's almost operational and about getting action. So if you keep things tangible and give them frameworks, you can usually get somewhere, even if they're not particularly strategic thinkers.
Mm-hmm. Have you got any examples of where, there's been really communication at an impasse and you've really been challenged to get things rolling, and what you've done to be able to move people along?
Yeah, I have. One, I find that timeline process a really good strategy if they're just battling big time. Or another example where I've used is, well, we're not getting anywhere here. We need to go back and do a review of their performance. So broad financial review, broad production review. So then they've got something tangible to look at. And another one I use is just putting broad numbers on their value. Okay, you're, pretty big numbers now with the way land prices are going.
Yes.
Righto, let's work out what you're worth. Oh, we're worth this block, this block, this block. Do it all in front of them. We're worth $20 million. Okay, there's 2 of you now. There's going to be 4 of you in 10 years' time. So what do you think tripling that looks like? And then how could we triple that? Trying to make it practical. So all of a sudden, they've done a plan and they've worked out where they might buy land and how much they need. And so they've actually done a strategic plan without ever knowing they're doing it.
Good.
Yeah.
Strategic planning by stealth. Moving your hands too much there, Kate. We've made it
sorry.
blurry. It's a very, very sensitive camera. Awesome. And just going back on that one for sharing as well too, and succession planning is something that now I'm moving my hands, but succession planning is something that you and I have discussed a lot, and that's a long-term planning activity that potentially has a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong. What are some of your key?
It's really
no, but what's some of your key advice when things are going wrong with succession planning?
Yeah. So, like any of this stuff, planning is a process, not an event. And succession planning is a process, not an event. And I find with both these things, we tend to run information sessions, a single event information session, and you're just not going to get anywhere.
No. And apologies, the camera has, really not enjoying life right about now. There we go, back.
Okay. And I'll just be really still. So that's the first, what I try to do with succession planning is to create awareness that it's not just about business structures. It's not a matter of rolling out a script, that it's, we've got 2 dynamics. We've got a family dynamic, we've got a change dynamic. And so it's going to take time. And because of that, it is useful to involve a third party, and it's not as simple as going to a lawyer and getting some documents written up or going to your banker or your accountant. That's the stuff that comes at the end once you've actually got an understanding. And quite often it's very difficult for the older generation to talk about this stuff because farming is attached to their identity.
Yeah. So
hope that helps.
Well, I think for me, one of the key messages that has come out of our conversation today is that this long-term thinking and planning is a process. It's not an outcome. So the very last question, what's the process that you follow with your clients to implement, review and refine their strategic plan, recognizing that just doing the plan and then walking away doesn't mean that that's going to lead to implementation?
Yeah, because we just get busy. Like we all get busy, and we've got to be doing the money-making things. So it might take 12 months or even 2 to 3 years to get a decent plan, and in some cases it can take 5 minutes. But what I tend to do is to have multiple touch points during the year, so some formal sit-downs, but also just create some accountability through, a phone call or an online check-in.
Yeah.
And it's about having that regular accountability. And I know I need this for myself. Some people are really good at internal discipline. I'm not one of those, so I need somebody being on my case. And just checking how, and the other thing that's complex about all this, because usually when you're doing this sort of business planning, there's a lot going on. People are in their 20s and 30s and they're meeting partners, and you might start the planning process and they're 21, they've got no clue. And it's a lot easier to be doing the process when they're all matched up, and it's very clear who wants to come home and who doesn't. So you just have to, it's like an evolving document, or it's not even, doesn't necessarily have to be in a document, but it's an evolving dynamic.
And that's when we were planning for this, Kate, you showed me a plan that you had on it, written on a empty beer carton. So it doesn't have to be a document.
No.
Well, technically it's a document.
No.
If it's on paper. So.
Yeah. So I asked a group this morning, I said, well, you know, what are your expectations? You're expecting a 30-page formal planning document? And he just went, no. And I said, well, is a one-pager with, you know, the key tasks, the key strategic things and who's responsible for them? He said, yep, that's what I want.
Perfect.
So sometimes I think we overcomplicate this stuff.
Beer carton works a trade.
It does. They relate to it. You've got to be able to, and farmers are having fun.
Yeah, perfect. So we're up to time, Kate. Just quickly, we do like to have a little bit of show and tell at the end of each of these. Any books, podcasts, anything in particular that you'd...
Apart from the obvious, there's one great book and a podcast I've really enjoyed. There's a woman called Doreen Clark, and she talks about how to do long-term planning in a fast-paced, crazy world. And I love the way we all talk about long-term planning and understand the needs for it, but it doesn't mean that we do it. And I think it's a bit like soil testing. We all know we should do soil testing, but it doesn't mean we do it. So Doreen Clark's podcast would be something I would look at. And there's quite a few resources on our website, actually, so you can jump in and have a look at that.
The Think Agri website.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Kate, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you to our audience for joining in. We hope that this has really stimulated your thinking. You'll see the details for our next webinar is popping up on your screen now. This is a conversation that I'm very, very excited about. We're going to be talking to Dr. Catherine Allen, who is the Professor of Environmental Sociology and Planning at Charles Sturt University. And she's going to be talking about some of her recent research with the soil CRC, exploring the relevance of adoption as a concept for agricultural land management in the 21st century. The Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub will also be holding an event on the 29th of March in Wagga Wagga this year, and that's going to provide a face-to-face opportunity to engage with many of the topics that we discuss in this webinar series. So if you want to find out more and keep across details for future Expanded Horizons webinars planned for this year, you can register for the Hub's e-newsletter Spoke, and the details for that are just popping up on your screen now. Once this webinar finishes, you'll be directed to a survey link. It would be very much appreciated if you could fill it out for us. That's your opportunity to tell us about any topics that you would like to hear about in the future. And as you'll see from today's webinar, we do take those on board and we do action them. And the survey doesn't take any more than a minute. So thank you again for participating in today's Expanded Horizons webinar. Thank you for tolerating the camera issues here. And thank you from the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub.